This is a summary of a book called Red Inferno, which is where the Soviets invade mainland Europe. You can buy it in the description, but if you want a light spoiler-free review of mine from the book, you can watch a companion video to this one. So the divergence point in this book is on April 1945, near the final days of World War II. So in our timelines, the Allies pushed very far into Germany, which eventually became the border of what was then to become the occupation zones of Britain, the USA, France, and the Soviets, and then later East and West Germany. So a man named William Simpson was the commander of the main army forces heading to Germany, and at the time near the Elbe, he actually planned to continue to Germany. This was mainly due to the influence of Churchill, who saw the Soviets just to be as much of a threat as the Nazis. He wanted to push for more lands. In our timeline on April 2nd, Truman, the president of the USA, decided to leave Berlin as an objective for the Soviets, and retreated to the Elbe River, and let the Soviets expand. Later, the divisions in our timeline occurred. Well, in the Red Inferno timeline, this doesn't happen. After Stalin doesn't follow the agreements to carve up Germany, the US government feels more threatened by Stalin's uses of force, and gives a green light to Simpson and his forces to continue to push towards Berlin, and later Potsdam with no resistance. To the threat of the Soviets, essentially, Churchill's paranoia about communism wins in the minds of the American generals. The main goal of this initial invasion was not to really scare the Soviets, but Stalin, of course, afraid that the Americans would quote-unquote liberate Hitler and free the remaining German forces from Soviet hands, reinforced more men to race to Berlin to push the Americans back. And due to a whistleblower in the Soviet embassy giving a note to one of the main characters of the book, the USA was made aware of the upcoming invasion with the Soviets in advance and geared up for the war. Near the outskirts of Berlin, the Soviets arrived with T-34 tanks and opened fire on all the Americans, who were really unprepared, heading towards the city. The Americans do shoot back, but the Soviets eventually do manage a victory. The Americans do make an attempt to de-escalate the situation so they don't have to go to war, but the Soviets claim it was a quote-unquote mistake and the Americans shot first. Stalin actually, secretly, was planning a westward invasion on the remaining Allied forces, westward of the Elbe River, believing that they would reach it in hours. The Soviets tried to take many Allied men hostage and now want a new treaty to prevent any war, and consider their previous Yalta conference in our timeline to divide Germany invalid. This treaty would start with the Allies moving out of Berlin and out of all of Germany. In our timeline, we had 4 occupation zones, but here, the Soviets wanted all the other countries to leave and to only occupy the Rhineland and areas outside of Switzerland, and to leave Austria fully to the Soviets, threatening further attacks if these quotas are not met. Meanwhile, the Russians formally began their invasion of the Allies, named Red Inferno, which is essentially a simplified version of the German strategy of Blitzkrieg. They would quickly push through Germany and deprive the Allies of any sort of resources or reinforcements to quickly take them out. Seeing the wretch to the west, the remaining German government, headed by Albert Speer and Karl Donitz, specifically meets in London with the Allies to conditionally surrender. Nazi Germany is still abolished and all, just like in our timeline, but the German forces are being redirected to the Allies to help fend off against the Soviets. So, essentially, the Allies basically take over the remainder of Nazi Germany. The Germans and Speer vow to erase Nazism and still pay for their crimes after the war, but this will have to be postponed. This is mainly because the Allies and the Nazis fear the Russians way more. The Soviets managed to stir up a communist riot in Paris, where the communists attack the train lines, and they really just want the French to abdicate from the war, which would be in the Soviets' favor, claiming that if the French don't leave the war and prevent the rest of the Allies from going through France, the Soviets will also invade France and turn them into a puppet, just like the rest of Germany and most of Eastern Europe. The goal obviously declined. The Russians cut their losses and continued to invade westward. In a counteroffensive, the Allies, attempting to deprive the Soviets of oil and petroleum, started a campaign of bombing the Caucasus and northern Iran, which was at this point occupied by the Soviets, by sending jets and planes from South Iran and Iraq. After this, the front lines became a stalemate, with the Allies out of food and resources to continue, and the Soviets out of fuel to continue. At this point, unfortunately, the British were a husk of the country they were at the start of World War II. Churchill, the main guy advocating for the war, was fighting re-election, and the country was still very weak, so they were kind of pulling out. While this, the US decided to allow the Germans, mainly the remainder of the forces of the Luftwaffe, the Air Force of Germany, to join up and to fight alongside the American Air Force. The unthinkable happens. Really. I couldn't believe it when I first read this, but the Swiss stopping neutral, and all the Allies in their airspace, essentially joining the war effort. After this, the Soviets managed a surprise invasion to break the stalemate on the American lines and push from the Levine River to the Weser River in West Germany. The Allies retreat again and again and again from the Soviets, which was puzzling to the army generals. Still, the divisions on the ground are barely managing by, with food, fuel, and ammunition shortage drying the Soviets thin. Soviets have a brilliant idea, alright? So they make a last-ditch effort to regain supplies by conquering the Allied oil supplies in a place called Dortmund. There are great rumors that the Allied supported Dortmund had all the resources that the Soviets needed to finish the push. If they managed to get that city, their failing invasion would turn around and would finally work in their favor. So they made a final effort to go westward and get to this damn city. When they got there, the Luftwaffe and German forces, which at this point were integrated into the US forces and under supervision, managed to beat them in the skies and the ground and basically decimated the Soviet airspace. But alas, they finally made it to the city, and upon opening the barrels, they found nothing but water and sand. They had been duped and conned by the capitalist Americans. They had wasted all their supplies and food to get here and hoped that they could turn around this war, and they can't now. They literally cannot. As a result, they were forced to fall back and assume a defensive position on East Germany to at least salvage whatever they had left. On August 6, 1945, a plane left a shipyard in Reykjavik, Iceland, heading for Paderborn, Germany. Due to information given by the OSS, a precursor to what we now call the CIA, this is where most of the high-ranking Russian generals and most of the Russian army were congregating. Originally dismissed as spy planes, one of the planes dropped a metal object on the city, which exploded to become a second sun. This was the first nuclear bomb, and had just been used in Germany. This destroyed most of the Russian tank and air force in the process, and it confirmed 30k dead, 80k wounded, and unknown dying of radiation sickness. After this, the Russian forces in all of Eastern Europe essentially collapsed. The remaining war generals were essentially shot to death. Luckily, the Allies managed to retake most of Germany and then push out to mainland Russia. Stalin was then assassinated by Beria, one of his advisors, and then a second nuke was dropped on Russia in an unknown location, and then a third one was dropped in Hiroshima, Japan. In a plea for mercy, the remaining Soviet government, headed by Beria, scared by the Americans' bluff to nuke Moscow and St. Petersburg, made an agreement to revert their borders back to how it was before the war even started. Japan then also unconditionally surrendered to the USA in fear of a nuclear attack, while Germany got a conditional surrender to all of the Allies due to their aid against the Soviets. After a while, by the end of the book in 1946, the Soviet Union was basically in a state of civil war. The Baltic states had broke apart and left, and the ethnic tension in the Union was at its highest. Most of Eastern Europe also declared war on the USSR after being liberated, alongside Armenia, Georgia, and Kazakhstan forming a temporary union to invade the Soviets. Germany is somehow still alive, but is essentially a nuclear hellhole, as 2 nukes had been dropped on or near their country, and the fallout mainly affected the country. America was the remaining sole superpower and the only nuclear power on the world stage. Look forward with hope as they wanted to rebuild Europe with the Marshall Plan. So after the main story, not much is said about the world or the exact treaties following at the end of the book, so I'm going to talk about my take on the borders of a post-war Europe. I don't think any of this is really realistic or what would have happened, but it's just an interesting take on the scenario. I did get some help from SpartanOdin for research on this topic, so if you were to check him out for this help, that would be great as well. Starting with Germany, the main loser of the war alongside the Soviet Union. First off, they lose a bunch of land, just like in our timeline, but not really as much because the Allies get to retake all of Germany and they get a conditional surrender. They mainly lose the Saarland to France and some northern territories to Denmark. The big kicker though was the splitting of the German country into 3 new countries, but not really how you expect it with the Morgenthau plan in our timeline. All the exclaves that Germany had are given independence, these countries being Westphalia and East Prussia, with having distinct cultures alongside the cut-off territories of mainland Germany being given to Poland. This was to weaken Germany, but not to the extent of the Weimar Republic, so we get a repeat. Besides this, Italy, another loser of the war, loses Slovene minority/majority lands bordering Yugoslavia to a new Slovene state. Speaking of Yugoslavia, I'd expect them to not really be so hardline communist as they were in our timeline, since the main socialist country, the USSR, is currently in caught fire and dying. So I think they've really just reformed themselves since they're surrounded by a bunch of nationalistic countries, right? Besides that, not much really changes with Northern and Central Europe, as most of the borders there are just resetting the map to how it was pre-World War II. Speaking of the Soviet Union, as was mentioned at the end of the book, mostly everyone bordering them just ganged up on them on a war on the entire country. I'd expect Finland to also be taking part in this, but to only regain border territories and not to push further. Alongside this, Romania and Poland also retake border territories, alongside the Baltic states joining up with them, and invade and start insurrections in modern-day Belarus, Ukraine, and Crimea. There's also a mentioned rebellion in the Caucasus and Central Asia, which I assume would fight the Soviet Union over the exclaves to the south. And that's basically it for this video. I also had a review of the book if you want to check that out in a separate video. Special thanks to Pumpkin and SpartanOdin for helping me with parts of the video of like scripting and stuff like that. I couldn't have really made it without their help. The next video I'm going to be working on is like an essay that's going to be like 30 minutes and 2 parts, so an hour overall. So it's going to be a while before I upload again because I really want to like make sure this looks good. But I'll keep constant updates if you want to join my Discord server in the description.